Now, with just over 7 months until Nigerians go to the polls to elect the next president, analysts say the 2023 election could be the country's most expensive year. One estimate says the contenders have spent more than 100 million US dollars on the campaign so far. Bankers predict the overall cost of the elections could total around 1% of its forecast GDP of $445 billion this year. And this comes at the backdrop of the country's deepest economic crisis since 2000 and hyperinflation. Joining us now for more on this is economist Muda Yusuf. He's a founder and CEO of the Center for the Promotion of Private Enterprise. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Yusuf, on the news tonight. Clearly, from records, we see an increase in GDP in the year that precedes the election. This has been this way since, the turn to democracy. Do you see that happening this year? And let's also take into consideration where our inflation is at the moment. What is your take?
Well, I don't see that happening because all the key indicators are not looking positive at the moment. This is a period of very big uncertainty for investors, and GDP growth is about the growth of investment. Now, the current uncertainty presents a number of elevated risks. We have elevated risk with respect to what we call policy risk. We have an aggravation of what we call political risk. A political risk in the sense that for investors that are interfacing with government or that are engaged in very critical government projects, at a moment like this, sometimes they feel nervous. Because if you look at the terrain of the country today, there's an estimate by the Nigerian Institute of Quantity Surveyors that we have over 50,000 abandoned projects. Many of these abandoned projects are victims or casualties of political transition, where those who take over government, whether from the same party or from another party, don't see government as a continuum. So there's also that risk, even as at now. We have many investors that are embarking or executing very big projects, government projects, some of which will transcend the current dispensation. There's a major risk that if there's a change in government, either within the same party or to another party, those projects may be at risk. The contractors may begin to struggle on how to get paid and all of that. There's also what we call policy risk, particularly for those who are engaged in long-term projects or long-term investments. There could be a change in policy. That's another source of worry for investors at this time. If there's a major change in policy, it could derail some investments completely. So that is another major concern. Then we have issues around the liquidity injection into the economy. I mean, you just gave some estimates now, although we need to validate some of this data, but clearly there has been a major injection of liquidity into the economy. That, of course, has some macroeconomic implications, particularly from the point of view of inflation. And of course, some of these funds are also government funds, which also raises issues around ethics and morality. So these are some of the concerns. Of course, there are concerns about possible violence, because elections most times also come with violence. And we are beginning to see indications of that.
Yeah, your point
That
is well
also
noted.
poses a risk.
But isn't that the general trend when it comes to democracies and electoral process, that they are expensive? There's an overflow of cash in the economy, and this leads to inflation rather than economic growth. Isn't that the trend we see across democracies around the world and just not here in Nigeria? But let me ask you, how do we cushion this effect? Because you make the point, yes, the political class and the people seem to be looking for the short-term gains. There's money in the system, there's a lot of flow of it, but there's the problem of inflation. So how do we cushion that?
Well, before I deal with that, let me acknowledge that there are some beneficiaries of these spendings, because it's not, there's a silver lining, let me put it that way. I mean, we have media houses, for instance. They are major beneficiaries because of all these adverts and things like that. We have people who provide campaign logistics for politicians. Many of them are also private sector players. We have people who also do adverts, social media, and the rest of them. We have printers. People have to print ballot papers. People have to put together ballot boxes. We need to support the election agencies with logistics. These are major expenditures that will end up with some private sector players. So to that extent, that is a bit positive. But generally, to tackle inflation is a very big issue. Inflation can be tackled both from the demand side and the supply side. But the phenomenon of inflation that we have in Nigeria is essentially a supply side or cost push inflation. So to deal with inflation, we must be dealing with the variables on the supply side.
So Yusuf, my biggest concern, I mean, people like Dr. Akinwumi Additional, would say no one can eat GDP. But my biggest concern is this: be it $100 million or not, we do know about the dollarization of the electoral process. I mean, that's a new phrase that was coined this whole period. My concern is what happens to the Naira when all the noise is gone? What happens?
Well, that is a major concern for our own currency. But again, I would say that is also a major macroeconomic challenge from the point of view of economic management. In elementary economics, there are what we call the quality of good money. For something to be money, first, it must have the ability to store value sustainably. So that when you keep it as a store of value, it doesn't deteriorate. It doesn't lose value. That is one very important quality of money. But what we have seen over the last few years is that the value of money has weakened significantly as a result of inflation. So that has affected the quality of our money. And that is why sometimes you see people preferring to go and store their investment or whatever in dollars than in Naira. So we need to deal with the inflationary situation. That is one. Secondly, we need to ensure that we also increase productivity in the economy. Because when there is inflation, it means that there are issues either on the supply side or on the demand side. But when we have productivity challenges arising from the cost of production, arising from insecurity, all of these things affect the supply side and therefore aggravates the problem of inflation. So those are some of the things. If we are able to deal with inflation, then we'll be able to deal with the value of money and restore the dignity of the Naira.
Okay, I'm glad you said it's not all headwinds. There are silver linings to this. But again, on the investment portfolios, the foreign direct investments you talk about, they may be skeptical at this time. It's a shaky period, transitioning from one administration to another. What would be your message to the policymakers, although they seem a lot focused on the electoral process at this time? But what would be your message to them, and how do we send the right signals to investors at this time?
Well, the way to send the right signals is to give confidence and to assure investors that unless in very critical cases, there is going to be consistency of policy. We are not to give investors assurance that we are not likely to derail policies, except in cases where the policies are really extremely very bad. That is one. Secondly, we need to also ensure that we give assurance that government is a continuum. We need to give that assurance, because when you have situations where people get into government and they disconnect completely from the previous government, that doesn't give confidence. We need to give assurance to investors that there is not going to be a major disruption in the flow of government transactions, in the flow of investment in infrastructure. That will also elicit some confidence. Then on the part of the investors themselves, they also need to do a lot of scenario planning to look at all the possible scenarios and how to also mitigate the risk through their own individual business strategy. So there are issues to be dealt with on the part of the investors, and there are also issues and assurance to be given on the part of the policymakers and our party candidates as well.
Well, the party delegates, a lot has been said about them this period, but we must thank you sincerely, economist Dr. Muda Yusuf, founder and CEO of the Center for the Promotion of Private Enterprise. Thank you for being on the news now.